Today we have three scholar activists from our ethical humanist community speaking on the topic replacing magical thinking with rational discourse and how can our free thinkers help restore democracy. Our first speaker is Joan Johnson-Lewis. Joan is a clergy person, coach, writer, and teacher, and has been an ethical culture leader since 1991. She currently serves the Riverdale-Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture, and she's served ethical societies in Chicago, Northern Virginia, and Brooklyn. As a scholar, Joan has had a special interest in studying humanism, social reform, the transcendentalists, and the history of women in world's religions. Her other areas of study include human relationships, history, science, progressive politics, leadership, nonviolent communication, philosophy, website design, and content and music. A bit far-ranging for sure. She has also served the American Ethical Union in multiple ways for many years. Joan was the leading force in the development and operation of the American Ethical Union's Lay Leadership Summer School, and that has been an essential catalyst for lay and professional leadership for many years. She served as interim executive director, was president of the National Leaders Council, and has been a key member of numerous committees and initiatives, including her current work in racial justice and lay leader training. Next will be Dr. David Sprintzen, who was a longtime professor of philosophy at the C.W. Post campus of Long Island University. He co-founded the Institute for Sustainable Development at Long Island University and was a founder also of the Long Island Progressive Coalition, the Research and Education Project of Long Island, and the Research and Education Project. Education Project of Long Island. Sorry, Dr. Sprintzen. Dr. Sprintzen is the author of 4 books on philosophy and social theory, and has been a long time and very active member of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. And following Dr. Sprintzen will be Christian Hayden. Christian has worked for years as a community educator in Philadelphia. A natural bridge builder, Christian has been effective at creating and maintaining connections and communicating with families, schools, and organizations. He spent a year in Ghana with the Humanist Service Corps and was awarded the Maslow Fellowship in 2016 for his proposal to develop a youth-friendly, educational, and trauma-informed, multi-pronged, colloquy-like experience with different partners in Philadelphia's schools, with community centers, and finally to spread the model to other cities and to other ethical societies. Christian is a member of the Philadelphia Ethical Society and also is an ethical culture leader in training, currently interning with the Ethical Society of St. Louis. He's described himself as a full-time facilitator, very part-time poet, and is striving to be a 24/7 humanist. So welcome to our 3 speakers. And Joan Johnson-Lewis will be starting us off. Joan?
Thank you, Bart. Today in the United States, a significant number of people truly believe that the president in the White House is actually the previous president wearing a skin mask. Well, it is actually no surprise that we got to where we are today. Chris Hedges wrote this in 2007. The split in America, rather than simply economic, is between those who embrace reason, who function in the real world of cause and effect, and those who, numbed by isolation and despair, now seek meaning in a mythical world of intuition, a world that is no longer reality-based, a world of magic. That quote is from his book, American Fascists. He concluded that unlike fascism in the 1920s through 1940s, in the US, no one had yet called for dictatorship or used physical violence to suppress opposition. In 1944, Henry Wallace was the sitting vice president when he wrote about fascism for the Sunday New York Times magazine. He wrote, "American fascism will not be really dangerous until there is a purposeful coalition among the cartelists, the deliberate poisoners of public information, and those who stand for the KKK type of demagoguery." Sound familiar? Maybe calling the press enemies of the public? Increasingly active white nationalism, anti-Black violence, and anti-Semitism? And cartelists? Henry Wallace again. Monopolists who fear competition and who distrust democracy because it stands for equal opportunity. Does that sound familiar? Add in the right-wing theocrats Hedges was writing about. Wallace also wrote in that 1944 essay, The supreme god of a fascist to which his ends are directed may be money or power, may be a race or a class, may be a military clique or an economic group, or may be a culture, religion, or a political party. Well, now they have moved to violence, harassing a congressional candidate so he drops out of the race, leaving unopposed someone who has called for putting bullets in the heads of those she opposes, allowing a pandemic to kill what will end up more than 500,000, many of those deaths preventable by action based on reason, evidence, and compassion. It's true, we've never had a full democracy or reason-based culture in the US. Genocide, enslavement, denying many the right to vote. These practices were defended with lies: the happy slave, the savage Indian, the superiority of white men. And it's also true that throughout our history, many have worked to deconstruct those lies, worked to expand who is represented and who represents. Moving towards more democracy depends on reason and fact. And what is the opposite of democracy? Well, one opposite is fascism. And by fascism, I don't just mean political bullying. Fascism has many different forms with some common factors. Among them, racial hierarchy, backed by authoritarian rule, nationalism, violence. George Orwell wrote of earlier American fascists, "One stands amazed at their diversity. What a crew. They are all people with something to lose, or people who long for a hierarchical society and dread the prospect of a world of free and equal human beings." He goes on, "Beyond all the ballyhoo and lies are the simple intention of those with money or privileges to cling to them." Again, does this sound familiar? As Hannah Arendt documented, fascism depends on people believing lies that their leaders tell, lies invented to manipulate those who are afraid of losing their money or privileges. Today's magical thinkers believe that they are the ones who are using evidence and reason. It is practically their sacred mantra: do the research. JFK Jr.'s assassination failed and he'll reappear. A pizza parlor without a basement is hiding children in the basement. Those conclusions are, for the believer, proudly based on research. They found YouTube videos, listened to podcasts, engaged with a community of self-identified skeptics, extracted meaning from cryptic revelations. It is as if, instead of feeling ears and tails of an elephant and thinking they found leaves and vines, they find leaves and vines and think that they found elephants. A task in the last few years was to simply outvote these folks, enable more eligible voters to cast ballots, put government power into the hands of people who are more egalitarian, more evidence-based in their reasoning, even if not perfect people. Narrow success by voting was met with violent attacks to prevent votes being counted. It is magical thinking to believe that the work is done with just one election. We heard from Chris Hedges about those numbed by isolation and despair. Decades earlier, Eric Fromm warned that fascism is an economic and political problem, but the hold it has over the whole people has to be understood on psychological grounds. Those who get caught up in what may be today's fascism are motivated by human needs: to belong, to find meaning, to matter, to identify with something larger than oneself, even when it turns out that's destructive of self, hurts others, and requires suspension of disbelief and a narrow circle of concern. Our limited human minds leave us all open to confirmation bias, to seeing ourselves in the best light and others in the worst, to deceiving ourselves that we're using reason and not emotion, to rigidify our beliefs when we're confronted with evidence that contradicts them, to narrowly define our circle of compassion. We've learned a lot about the psychology of cults and of those who believe the world is about to end. When people lose faith or predictions fail, some leave, but a core remains and their beliefs grow more rigid. Changing minds is not easy. But changing minds by reasoning isn't the only approach. Fascism thrives where there is social and economic inequality. Democracy and a more just society co-create and reinforce each other. Moving away from lies and a social economic hierarchy to democracy, equity, and inclusion isn't easy or quick, but it is where everyone wins. And next, we're going to hear from David.
Thank you, Joan. I see I was unmuted. I'm muted. Thanks again, Joan. What is magical thinking? It is fanciful, associative, and emotional thought. It is making mental connections by associations of images, elaborating, dramatically engaging, or emotionally satisfying stories. Its stories are often soothing, personally sustaining, even dramatically engaging. It is often psychologically encouraging, providing us with quite satisfying experiences. But it is thinking that is neither empirically tested nor critically reevaluated in the light of experienced consequences. We are all tempted by such ways of thinking and probably indulge in them quite often. We fantasize, we daydream, sometimes we even pray. And we certainly love dramatic stories, many of which are really quite imaginatively fantastic. We probably all want the world to be one that embodies our hopes, desires, and needs, to be a world in which we feel we belong, where we feel at home and safe. In short, to feel that we are in a world that assuages our fears and anxieties, uncertainties, and powerlessness. How else are we to understand the pervasiveness of human beliefs in eternal beings, or in heavenly fathers who look out for our well-being? Of course, imaginative thinking can often take us out of our ordinary humdrum reality and our daily routines. It can not only contribute to flights of fancy, but even sometimes nourish our creativity, originality, and artistic innovation. But unless it is intelligently reconnected to the objectively existing social and natural world, it remains nothing but a personal flight of fancy, magical thinking without constructive, practical, or social relevance. Even worse, however, it often invites identification and even possibly infatuation with its emotionally satisfying scenarios, thus presaging disaster when taken as interpretation of reality and as a guide to action. For magical thinking is not empirically accountable, nor rationally coherent. Rather, its associative imagery is fanciful, sometimes delusional, and thus not constrained by the need to take into account the real patterns of society and nature. As a guide to action, therefore, it almost invariably leads us in inappropriate, self-defeating, and likely destructive directions. That is why we need rational thought and critical thinking. So what then is rational thought and critical thinking? It is thought that is internally coherent and objectively attentive and responsive to the experienced consequences of events. The best way to understand the function of rational thought is to compare it to the using of tools, and thus to think of ideas as mental tools. Of course, we all know what a tool is: a material object made by someone for a purpose with reference to a job to be done. If the tool is the right one for the job, it will facilitate our task. But if the tool is not well made, or is not appropriate or well designed for the job to be done, it will certainly make a mess of the work. Now consider a map, which is a kind of tool to guide us around a terrain. To be useful, the map must be appropriate to the task. For example, a geological survey map would not be very helpful if we were trying to find what roads to take to get us to our destination. But the road map, or today the GPS, will only be helpful if it correctly maps the actual existing road patterns. Otherwise, it will be worse than useless. Similarly with thinking. All thinking involves some mapping of our world. And that means some interpretation of how things fit together. We have to decide what part of the world we are concerned with and what we want to do with it. To this end, we need ideas that accurately map that world. That is, that make sense of its structure, selecting the relevant causal interactions and the likely practical consequences of different possible actions. That's the very meaning of science. Empirical, experimental, self-correcting science is clearly the most reliable way to map our world. And that's, of course, our best guide to successfully navigating our interaction with that world. If, on the other hand, in place of scientifically based rational thinking, we were to rely on magical thought and the associative emotional patterns that make us feel good, it would be just like using the wrong or poorly designed tools. We're almost certainly going to make a mess of whatever we undertake. Just briefly consider a couple of examples. If you think it is obvious that crime is simply caused by criminals, you will probably conclude that the best way to reduce crime is to focus your research on the criminals that create it. For example, what is it about these criminals that causes them to engage in crime? Have you ever noticed that every time there is a mass murder, we become so focused on understanding the nature and motives of the killer? Focusing on the criminal, we will look into their background, perhaps their genetic endowment, and will probably increase law enforcement and even enhance legal penalties in order to repress crime and remove these criminals from society. But of course, with such a criminal character-based focus as your critical conceptual mapping, you are quite unlikely to even consider such possible social determinants of crime as poverty, joblessness, community deterioration, inadequate education, lack of social supports, family disintegration, even economic exploitation, political oppression, or cultural dehumanization. Wrongly mapping the conceptual and causal terrain is like using the wrong tool to do a job, and with similar results. Or consider the Trump phenomena. If you neglect the significant role that race plays, you will certainly miss an important element. But if you also think that race is the sole essential motive for most Trump supporters, you will completely fail to appreciate those deaths of despair that have devastated so much of white middle America, so brilliantly diagnosed recently by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Did you know, for example, for the period since the year 2000, the average life expectancy for the cohort of white Americans between 45 and 54 years of age has actually been declining? And that this is a pattern that is seen almost nowhere else on earth, and that includes among people of all races and ethnicities? It would thus be neither sensitive nor respectful to respond to the desperation of such people, as often too many well-meaning people have done, to claim that they benefit from white privilege. Not only would that be personally insensitive, but is almost certainly counterproductive. Communicating one's disdain for their suffering and driving them more firmly into the arms of those who do not insult them. So let us take our humanistic values and our rational and scientific analyses seriously, but also self-critically and with sufficient humility, always remaining on guard against the natural tendencies for self-reinforcing groupthink. We should recognize that our values and goals are never realities to be imposed upon the world as if they embody a perfected ideal, but rather we should treat them as continually revisable moral and theoretical guides furthering our present undertakings. That is the path forward for a rationally responsible humanism. Christian, it's all yours.
Good morning. In 2021, it will be an important activity to intentionally remember. The last few years were an intense, anxiety-ridden news cycle. It had the obvious, and one might add purposeful effect, of diminishing public memory. Granted, our ability as a nation to remember has always been in question, but the immediacy of news and the frantic pace of social media have made it important that we intentionally do so, to try to remember. So I will remember. And not long ago, though it feels like, I don't know, 2 years ago, on the 1st of November in 2020, James Croft laid bare that our democracy was in fact under attack, that we had to prepare for a moment where the process, the results of the election would be challenged, and we had to prepare to fight to protect our democracy. In hindsight, it contained great prescience, but at the time, I personally thought it might be too much. It was too much, that there was a danger and possibly panic-inducing disposition. I thought as a nation, we had safeguards, we had checks that would be fine. Here I will say, and I think this is the important point, there is a difference between passive and calm. I was passive, ready to watch and let it play out. James was calm in presenting that there was a problem coming and we needed to be prepared. I was wrong and James was right. We are in cascading moments of collective regression. If we do not do anything about it, this country may not fall, but families, communities, and many, many dreams of living a dignified life will. We need to remember that night. And whether or not you went, we need to think about the call for commitments. What are we going to do to not just protect, but expand this democracy? For the freethinker, the humanist, the ethical culturist, the idea of democracy is a spiritual undertaking. The search for it is a common and binding aspiration. The process of realizing, struggling towards it is one of our most important spiritual practices. Or as Octavia Butler put it, a positive obsession. Democracy as an idea, a process, is not just about voting. It is the embodiment of a thinking system. It is the measure of one's agency to feel and be connected to the workings and direction of one's society, one's community. This is beyond voting. Democracy is children feeling heard, teachers being supported, leaders responsive and beholden to the voices of the people they serve. Democracy is the constant realization of freedom that echoes from one's body and mind to their community. It is all being seen, the collective honoring of each individual through and through. And the last year, we had some important and notable things happen. The ease of voting amid a pandemic, the expanded the electorate, as well as grassroots organizing that wanted us to remember and imagine a different future. These all came amidst perhaps a common reckoning. The one conclusion many of us might agree with, that we commonly feel like our democracy, our leaders, our systems have failed us, that powerful people have outside influence, that opportunity seems to be available to a declining few. I think of Robert F. Kennedy's speech in Indianapolis on the day Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He, a white man connected to political royalty, spoke honestly and calmly in front of a crowd that was largely Black. He spoke to what faced our nation, a choice to lean into violence or to continue to work toward the free society that we could become. This is what leaders do: present the moments, the choices, forecast their principles, and stand by them. And they work towards a vision. I wanted to highlight this moment because it is that demeanor in times of upheaval, tragedy, that we want to embody, that we are primed for by what we foster in this community, in our societies. Thus, it is most important that we realize, hold on to, and expand who we are. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, Joan, David, and Christian.